start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Major General Retired Walter Gavan. I'm Senior Vice Chancellor of Advancement and Economic Development at Troy University. I'm also President of the Alabama World Affairs Council. And I'd like to welcome you, and I would like to take this opportunity as well to thank our partners. This has been a great partnership among Troy University, the Alabama World Affairs Council, and Air University, as well as many of our member institutions who are gathered here together to put on this conference, which is NATO at 70, a strategic examination of the past, present, and future of the Atlantic Alliance, a very timely topic for the times that we live in. And so I want to thank you for coming in. At first, before we proceed with our program, I would like to recognize some of our distinguished visitors. You're all distinguished visitors, but for the sake of time, if you'll allow me just to recognize a few. His Excellency Robert Hunter, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 1993 to 1995. His Excellency George Christian Mayor, Romania's Ambassador to the United States. Major General Cezary Wisniewski, Military Attaché, Republic of Poland, and I hope I didn't massacre that too much. I'm reminded, I served in Afghanistan with a brigadier general in the Polish army, and I asked him one time, I said, Richard, is Polish a hard language to learn? He said, Walter, no, or Waldo is my call. He says, Waldo, no, it's not hard at all. We have 8-year-old children speaking fluent Polish in Poland. Very grateful to have Ms. Laura Romano, the Deputy Chief of Mission for the Embassy for the Republic of Croatia, with us. Mr. Robert Bell, who has had many titles, but was a senior civilian representative in Europe for 4 different Secretaries of Defense. Mr. Bell. Dr. Vaidotas Sorbelis, who is Defense Counselor, the Embassy of Lithuania. And Mr. Roland Hennens, Defense Counselor, Latvia. And the Adjutant General for the Alabama National Guard, Major General Cheryl Gordon. And you'll be meeting my colleague, Dr. Lance Tatum, here shortly, Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Troy University. Before we get into our formal program, we have a special, can anyone guess what day today is? Well, it is. There's another thing it is. This is Alabama-Romania Cooperation Day. Yes. And we have proclamations. We have a proclamation from the Governor of Alabama I'll be about to read. The City of Montgomery, the Honorable Todd Strange, Mayor, and the City of Troy University, the Honorable Jason Reeves, Mayor, all recognizing Alabama-Romania Cooperation Day. And so if you will allow me, I will read the Governor of Alabama, the Honorable Kay Ivey. I will read her proclamation, and afterwards I will ask the Ambassador and Major General Gordon to join me up here for a photo and brief remarks. Proclamation by the Governor of Alabama. Whereas the Alabama-Romania National Guard Partnership is only one of 22 European partnerships that comprise the U.S.-European Command State Partnership Program, and whereas the cities of Mobile, Alabama, and Constanța, Romania have been sister cities for almost 2 decades, and whereas the relationship between Alabama and Romania is of strategic importance to NATO, and now, therefore, I, Kay Ivey, Governor of Alabama, do hereby proclaim November 1st, 2019 as Alabama-Romania Cooperation Day in the state of Alabama, and encourage all residents to recognize the cooperation between Mobile, Alabama, and Constanța, Romania, in the name of securing freedom and democracy in Eastern Europe. Given under my hand, Kay Ivey, Governor of the state of Alabama. General Gordon, Ambassador.
Well, I must say that this is a surprise, wonderful surprise for us, in a way not, because we have enjoyed cooperation with the National Guard of Alabama 26 years now in terms of our military, working together with the National Guard in Alabama in terms of training, modernizing, and getting more in communication at the human level with the Alabama military. And that meant a lot for the development of the Romanian armed forces. In terms of Mobile, relationship with Constanța, Constanța, you may not know, we may discuss about this, is a strategic location at the Black Sea, the main port of the Black Sea. And when we discuss about the eastern flank of NATO, this is a very, very interesting and complex situation in terms of security in Central and Eastern Europe, as the proclamation states. It's a great honor for us. I would like to thank the government of Alabama and the Troy University, of course, the National Guard of Alabama, for this great honor for my country, and we look forward to a fantastic conference. Thank you very much.
I just want to say, even though the governor declared today as the official day for the cooperation from the Alabama National Guard, every day is Romania-Alabama Cooperation Day. And we're excited, we continue to be excited about our partnership, both military and civilian, that we're expanding upon the civilian and economic side of it with our partners in Romania, because they are such great partners and they are committed to NATO, and their strategic importance in the region cannot be understated. And we deal with that on a daily basis. They deal with it, every day, all day. So we look forward to continuing our relationship and expanding it even more so. We celebrated the silver anniversary last year, and we're looking forward to even more. So thank you.
Thank you. You have in your packets an overview of today's conference. And what we're going to be doing, which is this first panel, followed by a tour of the Rosa Parks Museum, and then a keynote address from Ambassador Hunter. You'll have a visitor's guide, lots of opportunities this evening for you to enjoy yourself here locally. And then tomorrow we'll start with a breakfast here before the 9:30 start, so a continental breakfast. So if you're expecting a full English breakfast or something, no, but a continental breakfast. And then we'll get into our panels for tomorrow. Again, you have all that information in your packets as well. And without further ado, I think it's time to get into our program. So at this point, I'm very happy to turn over the mic to my colleague, Dr. Lance Tatum, who will lead the first panel on the 70th anniversary. Dr. Tatum.
Thank you, Waldo, and thank you for your attendance today at this conference. Certainly from my position as the Chief Academic Officer at the university, very pleased, very proud of our faculty within our Department of Political Science and our College of Arts and Sciences for their initiative and their work in getting this particular grant. I'll brag on them just for a second and let you know this was the only grant that was awarded in North America, and so we're very proud of the fact that that is being held here in Montgomery, Alabama with Troy University. My role today is to serve as the moderator for our first panel discussion. We will not be working in order from my right to my left. We're going to mix it up just a little bit and give each individual a chance to provide opening comments. I've spoken to them. They are all in agreement that they understand that there is a time that we want to try to remain in, although we're not going to stifle questions and answers that may come up during each panelist's presentation. So this particular panel is entitled "The Significance of NATO's 70th Anniversary," and that will be the context in which we begin our discussion today. Our first panelist that I will introduce, and you have bios in your packet, so I won't read through the entire bio. We'll just kind of hit the high points and move forward, and I won't go through all the bios first. We'll just start with each panelist, allow them to provide opening comments, and then move to the next. Our first panelist will be Dr. John Schmidt, who is currently serves as Troy University's Senior Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Administration. Dr. Schmidt is a retired United States Marine Corps colonel who has 25 years of service that spans from being a platoon leader in the Vietnam War to a strategic planner for the first Gulf War with General Schwarzkopf's staff. He has deployed throughout the Mediterranean region, working with the French Foreign Legion forces of Corsica and the United Nations forces off of Bosnia. He is an honor graduate of the United States Marine Corps Command and Staff College, and I'm very pleased and proud to call Colonel Schmidt my colleague. Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you, Lance. Well, good afternoon, everyone. The ambassador just reminded me I got the short straw, but being a Marine, I think that's the way we want to be out front. So, and also being a Marine, my presentation is going to be very simple. I like to keep things simple. So I had to go back and ask myself the question as we look at the 70th year anniversary of NATO. Today, could we or would we form a NATO alliance if one did not exist? And from that question, I began to look back a little bit in history to find out how NATO evolved, looked at my own experiences working with NATO, and then finally I'll provide the answer at the end. But let's go, and I see some grammar school students that are here, and I had to go back and look at my history too to find out how NATO evolved. And if you look in the post-World War II era, the United States is coming out of the atomic, or we're beginning the atomic age. We're seeing a Europe that is rebuilding, reconstructing, and it remains very much of a vital interest to the United States. And we see a Soviet Union shifting from an ally to an adversary. So that's kind of the overview as we look at things after World War II. We also see visionary leaders who were in place. President Harry Truman, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and if you look on the European side, Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of Germany, Clement Attlee, the United Kingdom Prime Minister. And each of these leaders sees the need for a common defense. They see a reliance on one another if we're going to restore and rebuild the European theater and restore those relations. The United States, as it is today, was recognized as a world leader. Other nations are reliant on her leadership. And the Truman Doctrine of 1947 sets the stage for overall engagement in the world. And I'd like to just read the Truman Doctrine of 1947 because it's very prescient. The United States would lead politically, militarily, economically, assisting all democratic nations threatened by authoritarian regimes. Pretty straightforward doctrine and a pretty good guidance as we look at the 1947 era going forward. We have the Secretary of State that I mentioned before who sees Europe as a vital interest. On the European front, we see a spirit of reconciliation and rebuilding. There's a renewed trust that is beginning to emerge. Clement Attlee, the UK Prime Minister, sees NATO and becomes one of the key architects of the NATO alliance to begin with. Konrad Adenauer begins the olive branch reconciliation with France and with the United States. And the U.S. and Europe see a common threat emerging, the common threat of communism. We see an aggressive Joseph Stalin trying to bring the European countries into their sphere of influence, doctrinally, militarily, and economically. My key point there is that we see how the conditions of the Mutual Defense Treaty emerge, and we see the U.S. as a leader, and we see the former allies working together collaboratively. Now, the question of would or could or should an alliance be formed was pretty much self-evident back in those days. Each nation viewed its national interests being woven together with one another. Then, as we look at the essential elements of the NATO treaty itself, we all know on 4 April 1949, some call it the Washington Treaty, but the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance was formed. And the United States, Canada, several Western European nations all become signatories to that. Today we know there are 29 nations, to include Greece, Turkey, and Germany, are part of that alliance. Article 5, which is often discussed, Truman called this article a shield against aggression, and I think that's a very apropos title for clause, Article 5. It's the Common Defense Clause, and it says attack on one nation is attack against all. I think some 70 years later then, as we look back, NATO has been tried and tested, yet the treaty remains viable and intact. And I'd like to give you some personal examples now of my interaction for my 25 years in the Marine Corps. Certainly began with Vietnam. Now the NATO alliance stood aloof from the United States at that time because they believed that was a standalone war that the United States was engaged in. However, I will say this, all our medevacs, our serious medevacs, all went to Germany. So the hospitals here in Germany played a vital role, even though the alliance itself kind of stood apace from the United States. I spent a lot of time in Norway. In fact, I got a chance to travel all the way from Oslo up to Kirkenes in the 1980s. I'll say this for my service. The Marine Corps saw the NATO flank of Norway being a very vital interest. We even have equipment, heavy equipment pre-positioned in the caves of Norway today. We prepared for the Cold War training back in the 1980s up by the Bardufoss, Narvik area because we feared the Soviet threat along the NATO flank, the northern NATO flank there. Well, then, the peace dividend comes and we kind of forget about the northern flank. Well, guess what we have today? Putin and the folks are coming across Alaska and they're doing overflight rights over Norway. So Norway becomes still a very much of a vital interest to us as we look at the commonalities. In the first Gulf War, I had the privilege of serving on General Schwarzkopf's staff, and if you recall during that time, that was the biggest evolution of troops coming into the theater since World War II. 500,000 American troops came into the Saudi Arabia desert. 500,000, 500,000, and all the related equipment. How did all that related equipment get there? Well, we had to have basing rights, overflight rights, and all that came through the alliance. Turkey became a key area for that. Germany, Italy, and other nations became, and that was because of the NATO alliance that we were able to do that, to bring those forces into Saudi Arabia in order to oust the Iraqis from Kuwait. In Bosnia, I had a chance to go to Split and work a little bit with the NATO forces there as we prepared perhaps contingencies. But I was also off the aircraft carrier, the Teddy Roosevelt, and we were planning air campaigns from the various bases, Aviano and all, in Italy in support of the air campaign for that war. And then finally, routine Mediterranean deployments, and one that I recall very, very carefully, and I have several ambassadors here. One of my responsibilities was the evacuation of the embassies in the Central Command area, and then also when I was afloat in the Mediterranean. We trained the French Foreign Legion off the island of Corsica, and they used our techniques, I think, later on in an evacuation of one of their embassies later on. But I felt very good that we were working together collaboratively. They were looking at our procedures, and it was great to work with Legionnaires. My whole point being is the interoperability of military to military was very strong and remains very strong today. Now, back to the basic question. Could we or would we form a NATO alliance today if one did not exist? I've given you a quick overview of how NATO evolved. Today, the NATO alliance is under stress. We see a belligerent Russia active on so many fronts: the elections, cyber warfare, Syria, Ukraine, the air overflights I just mentioned. We see a strengthening China with an emerging strong naval presence and also expanding its telecommunications capability within the European theater, with a question about communications integrity overall. My good friend, in fact, one of my lieutenants, former Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff Joe Dunford, was in Slovenia in August, and General Dunford said this. He says that the NATO military advantage over Russia has eroded. Turkey. We know what's happening in Turkey, but one of the key things of interest that I saw recently, I think it was around August, they purchased the Russian anti-air defense system, which complicates the entire defenses within the NATO area. And we have other stressors. We have the U.S. concern about impeachment. We've got the UK and the Brexit. We've got Germany and the rise of Islam. We've got terrorism in general. So these stressors all together go back to this answer. Could we or would we form a NATO alliance today? Now, the Marine in me wants to be very decisive, but my answer is maybe. Maybe. Because the conditions for the creation of NATO today are far different than they were in the World War II era. Yet the requirements for such an alliance remain. Let me give you quickly those requirements. We still need visionary leadership. We need visionary leadership that formed that alliance 70 years ago. That collaborative, can-do, make-it-happen type of visionary leadership. It requires political will. It requires political will, and it requires a leader who can bring that political will together. There's got to be a willingness to see that the NATO alliance is still a vital security relationship, that each nation state still depends on one another. And there's got to be an insistence that the alliance is relevant through the proper currency of training, funding, and equipment. My good friend also, General Mattis, who was a former Secretary of Defense, he, I thought, summed it up very well about the alliance. Not necessarily the alliance, but he said, and Mattis has got so many great quotes, I can't begin to remember all of them, but he says, on the battlefield, one can never have enough friends. The NATO alliance is one of those areas where we have strong friendships and they need to be maintained. So here's to another 70 years of NATO.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Our next panelist, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Mrazek, earned his commission in 1999 from the United States Air Force Academy, where he earned a BS in Western European Area Studies. He also holds a master's degree in diplomacy from Norwich University in Vermont and a master's in defense studies from King's College London, United Kingdom. He has served in operational assignments worldwide, and we are pleased to have with us Colonel Mrazek.
Sir, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today at Troy, especially to celebrate the 70th NATO. Thank you, excellencies, ambassadors, generals, sirs, ma'ams, doctors, and of course my wife Candace for being here today.
Good call.
So first I'll just start off with a disclaimer because I think I legally have to. The conclusions and opinions expressed here are my own. They do not reflect the official position of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, United States Air Force, or Air University. But hopefully they do represent something like that. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to recount some of the ideas and events surrounding the origins of NATO that remain important today. And thank Dr. Schmidt for highlighting some of that. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into those origins. So I'll highlight NATO's roots in fulfilling the regional and internationalist aspirations in helping to solve some of the international dilemmas we faced following the Second World War. To also look back to the early debates on the formation of the alliance. A lot of these still resonate today, and that's interesting. And we'll see that the enshrining the defense of democracy and enshrining those freedoms into the alliance's ideals were critical to cementing those ideas into the prevailing world order. So, but first, how many of you heard of predictions of NATO's imminent decline? Right, so about 25 years ago, I was told that NATO had won, and so at this point, Cold War had ended, threat was gone, and NATO was naturally on its way out. But I think we've seen that part of alliance theory hasn't quite held. We're quite lucky that it hasn't, and we've looked at other things. So there was and is more to NATO than a simple alliance designed to repel the Soviet invasion through the Fulda Gap. There's more to it than that. So if you take really a step back, so following the carnage of World War I, we saw the rise in the internationalist movements. And we saw in Europe the pan-European or pan-Europa movement was very important in the 20s and 30s. Ultimately, that movement obviously failed, and Europe did not unite at that point. But the idea didn't go away. World War II would only reinforce that. We saw that lesson of returning to the nationalistic status quo in Europe was not a way forward, and we're lucky for that. So from the end of the Second World War, you have the European Federalist movements had gained a lot of traction. And so now you have the European-wide Union of European Federalists, you have the European Parliamentary Union, and you have this press for integration on many fronts. Well-known political figures like Winston Churchill played prominent roles at conferences like the Congress of Europe at The Hague in 48 and a series of meetings. So this is a big movement at that time. So they identified there was a real and maybe fleeting opportunity to cement those democratic ideals and freedoms they had just fought for during the Second World War. So as Dr. Schmidt alluded to, these democratic ideals and freedoms are already slipping away from the eastern flank in Eastern Europe. So Soviet expansion coupled with spreading of communist ideology was now obvious. Making this worse was the stagnation of developing any type of international agreement. And that became an obvious threat to the war-weary Western powers in the late 40s. So if you look, many of the states of Eastern Europe either lost territory or via annexation or had moved into that Soviet sphere of influence. And with this, any geographic buffer that Western Europe had now disappeared and really became the staging area for any future Soviet expansion westward. So, but where were the United Nations at this point? Where was the United Nations? And so the international organization that was designed to prevent and rectify this threat to free peoples, really the Soviet veto, just by design, we were in trouble from a United Nations standpoint for international agreements. And so it had rendered the Security Council essentially ineffective for resolving security issues that we're facing. And it became evident that the body designed to internationalize security was stymied. And so these states and their leaders were looking for ways to internationalize security without nullifying the still new United Nations. So if you get to September of 47, you have Canadian Secretary of State for External Affairs, Louis St. Laurent, who later be Prime Minister, briefed the UN General Assembly, and it's quite important. It really illustrates a good sentiment. He said, nations in their search for peace will and cannot accept indefinitely and unaltered a council which was set up to ensure their security and which, so many feel, has become frozen in futility and divided by dissension. If forced, they may seek greater safety in an association of democratic and peace-loving states willing to accept more specific international obligations in return for greater national security. Such associations, if consistent with the principles and purposes of the Charter, can be formed within the United Nations. And that's an important point, that internationalism was not gone at this point, but it's rooted in those, NATO is rooted in those ideals. So therefore, the like-minded Western powers would seek to form an organization to reinforce security on a regional basis by forming NATO. Well, no, not NATO, actually. It was technically impossible, and I'll come to that point. So they formed WUDO, so the Western Union Defense Organization, often forgot about amongst all the different acronyms out there. But by 1948, so you had the five powers, UK, France, and the Benelux, had come together to agree the Brussels Treaty. And this defensive alliance was actually mainly aimed at Germany as they were negotiating it, but they started looking further east as this was developing, and they could see that clearly this was going to have more than one purpose for this treaty. But the Western Union Defense Organization had a standing military committee, a joint staff, air, land, and sea commands, and actually managed military resources. So there were a lot of those functionalities coming together. Those integrationist sentiments were clearly working. And it's interesting to note that the U.S. and Canadian representatives were there alongside the five powers throughout the negotiations with that transatlantic interest. But at this point, it was actually legally impossible for the U.S. to join the treaty. So if you look back to the congressional record, you see it's interesting. We can see some of the still familiar debates going on that we see today. So the U.S. Senate would have to break for more than a century this time of foreign policy to join the peacetime alliance. So led by Senator Arthur Vandenberg, you had Resolution 239, and it advocates the progressive development of regional and other collective arrangements for individual and collective self-defense in accordance with the purposes, principles, and provisions of the UN Charter. And again, we see this desire for internationalism being expressed. So a few weeks later, in July of '48, the five powers, Canadians and Americans, would begin meeting in Washington to negotiate the North Atlantic Treaty, or the Washington Treaty, and other states would soon be invited to form the original NATO. Ratification, though, was not without detractors, and I think that's important to remember. But the debate, the themes of the debate, actually really are not like on those of today. So ideals, threats, burden sharing, isolationism are all things you hear throughout the record. And so invoking the shared ideals of freedom and democracy, you had people like Dr. Schmidt mentioned, Secretary of State Atchison, appealed to the affinity and natural identity of interest of the North Atlantic powers, the product of 350 years of history, and really appealing to that identity aspect. Warren Austin, who is the chief delegate to the UN, affirmed, one, that the North Atlantic Treaty was consistent with the ideals of the United Nations and would actually be enforcing what the United Nations was, the spirit of the United Nations. But it also mentioned the threat, straight out. So NATO would aim to correct the apparent misconception of Soviet leaders that they can continue gaining objective after objective through the use or threat of force. And he reaffirmed that the Euro-Atlantic Alliance would directly support the cause of peace. And the cause is to discourage aggression by showing a firm determination to resist armed attack. Its character is defensive, its object is peace. And you hear that today. Taking the realist approach, you had General Omar Bradley, then Army Chief of Staff, who is really no stranger to war in Western Europe at this point. He also outlined the reasons. He counted that it cemented then 11 nations within the Western sphere, preventing them from joining the satellite of an aggressor. Highlighting the traditionalist, he pointed that the value of more than 300 million people, the industrial capacity, and all the other military and political factors would be essential if ever called on for another great war. But there are also detractors, and there is an opposing position, and really pointing to that burden sharing and the nationalist-based concerns. So you had people like Senator William Jenner describe to the Senate that the years of aid programs, really only a couple of years of aid programs at this point, had not had their desired effect, and that Europe had not become the third force that was really serving as the bulwark between the U.S. and Soviet Russia. So the military-only return on investment was just not high enough for some people. And also, there's a still familiar isolationist argument that resounds, and invading against all manners of foreign entanglement, but especially against committing ourselves to a ground war in Europe when we demonstrated in the last Great War that Russia, because of its manpower, could not be conquered in continental war. So I think 70 years of deterrence have rebutted this argument pretty effectively, which we're very thankful for. But it's really only if all the parties remain committed to Article 5, and that's really essential when we get to any talk about NATO. So this far, the pro-NATO arguments have won out, but we always have to be ready to answer those who argue on a more narrow, transactional view of NATO's raison d'etre. So having just left a NATO assignment a few months ago, I can attest daily to the hard work that the men and women of NATO are doing from all of our countries, and the hard work that's going on to guarantee our peace. So today, I'll just close with NATO remains not only the preeminent defensive alliance for the Euro-Atlantic area's democratic and peace-loving nations, but it's also partnered with like-minded democracies and free peoples around the world. So the willingness of NATO to represent and defend the ideals to which the NATO nations have committed themselves remains as critical today as it did 70 years ago. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to talking to more of you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Mrazek. Dr. Mary Hampton has been professor of national security at Air Command and Staff College at Air University since 2003 and was the associate dean for academics from 2010 to 2014. Dr. Hampton's area of research and teaching expertise includes NATO, European security, and security policy, Russian foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy and security policy, and identity politics and international relations. Dr. Hampton has received the NATO MacArthur Ford Foundation and Fulbright Fellowships that facilitate research in the areas that I mentioned above. At this time, I'd like to welcome for comments Dr. Mary Hampton.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody that's put the conference on. It's a pleasure to be here, and my fellow panelists. I must say also, along with Jeff, the conclusion and opinion expressed here are my own, and they do not reflect the official position of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, U.S. Air Force, or Air University. So, basically, I'm going to kind of continue from the last talk, but also circle back to Dr. Schmidt's original question. Would NATO be formed today as it was in 1945? I rebelled against that question when I first heard it, and then I endorsed it. So you'll hear. Because I want to answer it by asking the following question. What made 1945 so unique? What made 1945 to 1950 so unique? I'm working on a project right now where I look at those moments after great power war. These are the moments where the international order gets created. So for me, the main and the most successful product of that post-war order starting in 1945 is NATO, and I'm going to go into that in just a minute. But there were certain things in place after the Second World War that made it possible for us to be sitting here today, 70 years later, still talking about NATO, the longest standing alliance in history, and one whose imminent demise is predicted today, as it was in 1956 after Suez, and in the 1960s with Vietnam, and in 2003 with the war in Iraq. So one of the things I want to suggest here is NATO is always in crisis, so we shouldn't be too alarmed, and I'll talk about that as well as I get into it. So what makes 1945 so unique that enables the creation of NATO? First of all, the United States emerges for the first time as world leader. Europe lies in absolute ruins in 1945 after the war. The Soviet Union is victorious, but it also has suffered incredible, devastating infrastructure damage, human loss, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to say this is a unique moment in history for the United States, and what kind of order will the United States create? The United States always saw itself as very different. The United States intentionally tried, and I think succeeded to a large extent, in constructing an international order after World War II that was in direct contrast to previous balance of power structures as pursued during the periods of European realpolitik. So what does that order look like? For me, after World War II, the order was a modified version of the Wilsonian blueprint. Woodrow Wilson tried, failed to help create order after World War I. As we know, with the Versailles Peace Treaty, world order did not emerge. The United States did not emerge as leader, but the blueprint was still there. And the folks we call the greatest generation, that generation of policymakers after World War II, in fact, took that blueprint and, to a large extent, put it in play. So I think this is a really important thing to think about. So some of the leaders after World War II for the United States were actually responding to the lessons they learned after World War I. And I think precedent is a very important thing to think about when we talk about emerging world orders. What is the precedent? What am I learning from? And these leaders did, in fact, learn a lot from the failed Versailles Treaty and the failed Versailles Peace. I always found this very interesting. John Foster Dulles was at Versailles, the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and he, in fact, did some work on the War Guilt Clause that Germany was forced to bear after World War I. So definitely lessons in mind as we move into the US-led post-World War II order. What were the four major objectives, to my way of thinking, of US policy? Number one, rebuild ravaged Europe. If you haven't read any books, there are so many books that have come out in the last 5 years that really depict the damage, the devastation, the absolute tragedy of Europe right after the war. You should really read some. I mean, Google them. There are lots of good books. You know, hundreds of thousands of people on the move, displaced. Infrastructure damage upwards of 70% in some places. This was a ravaged continent, and U.S. leaders were right to be very worried about trying to rebuild civilization or help the Europeans rebuild civilization after, from that devastation. Also, U.S. interests, people get very cynical about this. I'm not cynical. The U.S. prefers to spread democracy. Like it or not, succeed or fail, the U.S. tries to spread democracy as part of its world order. Can it be cynical? Absolutely. But that is a part of U.S. foreign policy goals, and it was after World War II, and the focus was Europe. And part of that is, to me, so important. It was to integrate Germany after the war. Do not repeat 1919. Integrate Germany and democratize Germany. Do both of these by integrating Germany into the Western institutions that are emerging. These are cornerstones, to me, of U.S. world order after World War II. And I'll say this, there's the UN, there's the World Bank, there are other institutions. The cornerstone for these objectives was NATO. And I think it still is. So from the beginning, I've always disagreed with my colleagues who see NATO almost exclusively as a military defense pact. I've never seen it as such. I've argued for years. It was a dual-headed creature. It was military defense, but it was also very much the cornerstone of building a political community. And if you need evidence to that effect, I turn quickly to 1989, the end of the Cold War in that period. James Baker, Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush, gave a speech in Berlin that was really, really kind of history-making. Because he basically said in Berlin, there as the wall was coming down and things were in radical transition, he said, NATO has accomplished much of its military security goals, and now we can turn to NATO as a political community building institution in Europe. And we did. And so the 1990s, in my mind, become the decade of democratic enlargement, led through NATO, led through the European Union, and I would argue, in retrospect, it was very successful. It didn't do everything, and in fact, part of the problem we have today is the fact that it didn't do everything, but then who does? Right, so what happened? What did NATO not accomplish that we're living with today that I think, again, are we in a crisis in NATO? Perhaps. We can talk about that during question and answer period. What NATO clearly didn't do is integrate Russia. So after World War II, learned a lesson, integrate West Germany. We did not learn that lesson, integrate Russia, after the Cold War. And I've interviewed a lot of people and talked to a lot of people. The interesting thing is NATO was so successful in what it did. Nobody in the West, well, I won't say nobody. The consensus in the West, though, was essentially we don't want to do away with NATO. NATO with the EU will be the cornerstone of integrating democracies further to the east through Article 10 in NATO. But the problem with it was it really didn't have a remedy for Russia. And that's what we're living with today, what to do about Russia. NATO has had lots of moments where it comes together with Russia, it cooperates with Russia. To a tiny degree, there was some assimilation, but there was never integration. So that is an issue for NATO today that it faces in Europe, still to me as the alliance in Europe. We can talk about global NATO, but I'm much more interested in regional NATO. What are some other problems that are now have emerged since the end of the Cold War? Well, out-of-area missions. And where do we go from here with out-of-area missions? After Afghanistan, after Libya, and so forth, even Operation Allied Force. Some other issues, of course, the never-ending balance of payments debate. It goes on today, it's not new. But today we also now have new issues, we think, with a declining commitment on the part of the United States. This is seen by many as a real negative point in NATO's future. We can talk about that. I think it's a little bit exaggerated. But also, and this one I think is kind of a problem, we really have begun to see a decline of democracy across the world, but including in the West. And what does that mean for NATO, and how do we remedy that? So here's my answer to all of this, quickly. I think NATO's here for a long time. I've been teaching an elective on NATO since I've been here in 2003, and every year someone says to me, why do you teach such an irrelevant elective? And I say, ask me next year. So it continues to be relevant. I think it will continue to be relevant. And if we turn just for a moment to something called institutional theory, I think we get a good insight as to why NATO is still strong. And if you ask individual NATO members, no one really wants to leave. No one's satisfied with it, but no one really wants to leave. And part of the reason for that is through institutional theory. This institution has deep roots that have grown over 70 years. Think about that, an alliance standing for 70 years. That's pretty remarkable. So trying to calculate the cost of exit from such an institution becomes kind of overwhelming. We see this even with Brexit today, right? The cost, the calculation of Britain actually leaving as it sinks in becomes very hard to calculate, and so exit is very, very costly. And on that very optimistic note, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hampton. Major General Cezary Wisniewski has served for 28 years in the Polish military service, during which he has occupied a variety of positions within the Air Force of Poland. He currently serves as the Defense, Military, Naval, and Air Attaché at the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Washington, D.C. From 2013 to 2014, he worked for the Polish Armed Forces New Management and Command Systems team as a senior specialist and has acted as commander of the NATO Deployment Forces unit in Warsaw. General.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Let me start with the thanks to the Troy University for organizing such kind of the important conference with the fascinating topic. It's an honor for me, to be here among distinguished panelists and to express my insights on the topic. I would like to talk a little bit about the Poland perspective and about NATO Eastern Flank perspective. But first of all, let me start with some digression. It was a dream for a generation of Poles to join Western European security and economy framework. We Polish people were granted both membership of the NATO and the European Union. We are grateful to all who supported us in this journey. We appreciate you as leadership then, and we ask for more. Since its creation in 1949, the NATO membership has grown from the 12 founding fathers to today's 29 members through the 7 rounds of enlargement. Poland was granted the NATO membership in 1999, and we believe that this enlargement is the more important, is a milestone for a NATO development. This year, the first 3 former Warsaw Pact countries joined the alliance. This year, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary acceding to NATO. For Poland, joining the NATO was like seeing its 1980s dream come true. Joining the alliance finally confirmed the Poland's sovereignty and independence, as well as the departure from the Russian sphere of influence and entrance to the Western geopolitical zone. I will not hesitate to say that generation of Poles has been waiting for this moment since the end of the World War II, when actually our Western alliance pushed us towards the Russians' arms after the World War II. Of course, Poland, we weren't ready for a NATO membership in 1999, but the clear alliance vision and the brave political decision of NATO leaders let us join. Thank you very much for that. We, Poland, have paid the debt back to alliance since 2001, when the Polish troops has been deployed to Afghanistan under NATO-commanded Article 5 operations. Our Polish approach to the alliance has changed since we joined. At the beginning, we saw only Article 5, collective defense, as the main gain from the membership. But growing Polish economy, near threat, not sufficient NATO resources, capabilities in the region move us to Article 3 as even more important than Article 5. Don't read me wrong. The collective defense will still remain the foundation of the NATO alliance. However, Poland, as a large country in the region, we can and want to take bigger responsibility for the alliance. Poland is a reliable NATO member. We fulfill NATO obligations, 2% of national GDP for military spending, and more than 20% of military budget for the modernization. We wish all the NATO members to pursue these objectives, and we strongly support US efforts to encourage other allies to spend more for defense. We appreciate the NATO and the US decision made at the NATO Warsaw Summit in 2016. NATO has proved its unity, cohesion, and commitment to its eastern flank. We acknowledge the NATO members' efforts and decision to allocate of significant but not sufficient resources in the region. In addition, we recognize US commitment to Poland and in NATO to the decision to deploy the ABCT and EFP battalion to Poland was a milestone in effective deterrence. We fulfill our obligation to the allies as well. Polish troops are currently deployed to Latvia and Romania under NATO Forward Present concept. The recent President Trump's decision to deploy additional 1,000 US military personnel to Poland confirmed the steadfast US commitment to NATO and eastern flank. Is it enough? That's a good question, and we in the region think that it's not enough. We see the necessity of deployment of the full-fledged US division to Poland or to the region with the combat enables to build and maintain effective deterrence in the region. I believe that the decision about this 1,000 US military personnel deployment to Poland is just a starting point for such kind of the reinforcement in the future. And of course, our offer to finance some of the expenses of the US because of the deployment is still on the table. Profound modernization plan will allow Polish military to bring more sophisticated assets to the fight. We have acquired more and more artillery and the rocket system, self-propelled Howdy Scrap, 120 millimeters mortar, RAK, HIMARS, Naivar strike missile, and JASM missile give us unique capabilities to strike up to 500 kilometers. And with the JASM extended range, which is going right now even more. NATO has adopted itself since the creation. There have been identified a few alliance objectives. We believe that the most important objective will stay the same since the beginning. NATO is foremost responsible for building effective deterrence towards Russia. Let me conclude with saying that through the 70 years of its existence, the NATO has confirmed its unique capabilities to adapt to changing security environment. It is an ongoing process with challenges like a new cyber of hybrid threats, NATO force readiness, command and control, or issues, and some opportunities like European Union partnership or post-INF security environment, which pop up recently. Poland will support all efforts which make NATO alliance more effective in deterrence and more lethal if deterrence fails. Thank you.
Thank you, General Wisniewski. In 2017, Robert Bell retired following a 45-year career that included service in Brussels, Belgium, as the senior civilian representative in Europe for 4 secretaries of defense, and 3 years of service as NATO international staff at the international staff as the Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. Currently, Mr. Bell serves as CEO of National Security Council and also serves as Distinguished Professor of Practice at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. Mr. Bell.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Tatum. I grew up in Birmingham and spent quite a bit of time at Maxwell, in part from my own Air Force service, but also General Gordon because my dad was a 30-year fighter pilot veteran of the Alabama Air Guard. So I wanted to get that shout in for the Alabama, out for the Alabama Guardian. So it's a real pleasure to be home here in Montgomery with you today. I think the most significant feature of NATO's 70th anniversary is that for 7 decades, NATO has kept the peace in Europe and endured, notwithstanding crisis after crisis throughout its history, several of which were highlighted by Colonel Mrazek and Dr. Hampton. And although, as they also noted, pundits and some academics have repeatedly forecast the alliance's demise, it survived. But not just survived. It has repeatedly adapted itself to the changes in the international security environment, and time again through creative diplomacy, common purpose, and the powerful effect of shared values, found ways to reach consensus and maintain solidarity even when the odds seemed insurmountable. In fact, today NATO is as resolutely and widely engaged in this basic task as ever. It's not on intensive care or life support. A glance at NATO's website just last week during the Defense Ministerial would highlight, if you looked at it, the wide range of missions through which allies together are still engaged in the hard work of keeping the peace and deterring aggression. And there's a veritable alphabet soup of important military operations that you can look up, from EFP to RSM to KFOR to NMI. And extra credit to all those in the audience that know what all those acronyms actually mean. Trust me, it's an impressive list. And I think just as significantly, 3 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, sovereign states in Europe still want to join the alliance. And I hope that those in the audience today are aware that just last week, despite all of the dysfunction and partisanship coming out of Washington these days, by a vote of 91-2, that's very rare these days in the United States Senate, trust me, 91-2, the Senate voted to provide its advice and consent to the resolution of ratification for North Macedonia to join NATO. So in that sense, one could argue that NATO at 70 is still alive and well. And yet, reading the headlines and media reporting on last week's ministerial, the impression created is one of an alliance that has again been plunged into a deep and perhaps existential crisis. This time by last month's Turkish incursion into northeastern Syria and the Trump administration's decision to pull U.S. troops out and abandon our Kurdish partners there that had led the fight with us against ISIS. So where does the truth lie? Is this really the crisis that shakes NATO to its core? Or should we trust, as Secretary General Stoltenberg argued last week, that NATO will again find a way to muddle through? I believe the answer depends on how one assesses why Turkey is behaving as it now is and where it is heading under President Erdogan. And not just with regard to the stress he's putting on his nation's democracy, his ill-advised acquisition of the S-400 air defense system from Russia, and his public threat now to build Turkey's own nuclear arsenal, but also in terms of whether, in the most fundamental sense, he still views NATO as an indispensable and inviolable pillar of Turkey's security policy going forward. Is it actually the case, as Secretary of State Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Esper said last week, that President Erdogan had resolved to send the Turkish forces into northeastern Syria no matter what? and that the administration consequently faced a stark binary choice: either get the U.S. troops out of harm's way or fight a war with a NATO ally. Was Erdogan really undeterrable at that pre-attack stage? Did the United States really have no effective leverage or threaten the retaliatory measures that would have led him to reconsider? If Turkey, a member of NATO in full standing, that's contributed so much to alliance security over 70 years, was now, in fact, perfectly prepared to engage in what Secretary Pompeo termed kinetic conflict with the deployed military forces of the United States, like the men and women in uniform sitting here today, the deployed forces of the leader of the alliance, then NATO's viability, in my view, would, for all intents and purposes, be undermined. No consensus-based collective security alliance could long endure if one of its members is willing to go to war against that alliance's leader to address a border security concern, however legitimate some of Turkey's concerns may be. The NATO treaty provides no mechanism for expelling a wayward ally. Hence, if Turkey were now really to be so blatantly dismissive of its larger security interest as to be willing to conduct an attack on U.S. military forces, and it were to refuse to take the initiative to withdraw from NATO, then in my view, the United States and its other allies might well conclude that they had no recourse but to turn to some as yet undefined alternative security arrangement. However, I do not believe that if U.S. troops had been left in place and a red line, to use a term, had been drawn against an attack on them, that Turkey could not have been dissuaded. That is because I do not believe it is the case, at least yet, that Turkey, under President Erdogan, no longer accepts the basic strategic quid pro quo for Turkey, as it is for all allies, that they enjoy the collective security benefits of Article 5 and America's extended nuclear deterrence guarantee, and in return, our allies on occasion are required to make compromises and moderate their behavior. Rather, I believe President Trump gave a green light, unnecessarily in my view, either through a failure to fully calculate the dire consequences of his decision, or simply because accommodating Erdogan to bring our troops home fit with a domestic political objective that he wanted to reemphasize. If that's the case, then NATO now faces a different crisis, a crisis that for some allies, not all, but for some, brings further into question their already growing doubts concerning the reliability and predictability of the United States as an ally in NATO. And that, too, has major adverse implications for NATO's future, including the urgency with which some allies, again, not all, but some, will look to strengthen security arrangements in the EU, however inadequate those arrangements would be, in my view, compared to NATO. But that, and this perhaps is the good news in all of this situation, that, in my view, is a manageable crisis, one whose damaging consequences can still, to some degree, be contained. But that requires determined efforts by the Trump administration to find ways to reassure those allies who've been so shaken that the United States still intends to maintain influence in the Middle East and aggressively prosecute the remaining challenge of extinguishing ISIS. In this regard, certainly last weekend's killing of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which was facilitated through cooperation with the Kurds, could not have been more timely, as was the President's course correction on the recommendations of Secretary Esper and Pompeo to allow a limited reintroduction of U.S. troops into another part of Syria for another reason, to secure oil resources and keep those out of ISIS's hands. But whatever it takes. Both developments, in my view, have been well received at NATO. And I am reasonably confident that Dr. Hampton will be able to teach the NATO elective again next year and for some more years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Last night at dinner, I had the opportunity to learn from our next panelist that he was a baseball fan. And so, Ambassador, you now have the cleanup spot. Ambassador Robert Hunter served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 1993 to 1998, and he was the leading architect and U.S. negotiator in adopting the alliance to support Cold War world and negotiating the NATO airstrike decisions that ended the Bosnian War. He has served on the domestic staff in the Johnson White House and on the National Security Council staff under President Jimmy Carter as the leading member for Europe and then the Middle East. Ambassador Hunter, it is now your job to bring us home.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here with all of you good folks here, which I think demonstrate the continuing concern of the American people with the outside world, and particularly with the things that we care about in this animal called NATO. Being now, as our chairman just said, from Washington, D.C., I should say that NATO's future is even more secure than that of the Washington Nationals, which 5 times went from near defeat to victory. So don't worry about NATO. As a Red Sox fan, however, one always wonders about next year. Now, I'm in an unfortunate position. There was a saying once in somebody sitting in the gallery at the United States Senate listening to the conversation, as senator after senator repeated the same thing, and he said, "Hasn't everything been said yet?" He said, "Yes, but not everybody's said it yet." I think the striking thing is how much in agreement all 6 of us are about the history of NATO and its purposes and its future, so much so that I hereby declare that I'm canceling my talk later this afternoon, and we're going to go not just to the Rosa Parks Museum, but something almost as important, which is the Hank Williams Museum, those of us with country music. Now, to go immediately, could we recreate NATO today? The answer is no. The other thing, if you ask the American people, could we recreate the Bill of Rights? The answer is no. Things happen to happen in moments of history with peoples of leadership who will do things that are required, and then when in being, they acquire a life of their own. It's already been talked about how important it was for the United States to make its commitment to Europe on a permanent basis, beginning in the late 1940s. Let me remind people, the North Atlantic Treaty was the first time the United States had undertaken a treaty security commitment to other countries since 1786, when you did it with the French. And 13 years later, of course, we declared war on the French, but fortunately they were busy with the English at the time, so they didn't take us up. Now, we're told that today is not just All Saints' Day, but Alabama-Romania Day. Compliments to General George Jalwan, with whom I had the privilege of serving at the time, in creating the partnership programs with individual states. And Alabama got Romania. The fact that that took place and has with all the other Central European countries is a tremendous achievement. Tremendous achievement. I first went to Romania when I worked for Ted Kennedy in 1974, and we met with a man named Ceausescu. Okay, everybody heard about him? What he did to his country, and the well-deserved end he and his wife had near the end of the Cold War. And yet today, NATO has a new Deputy Secretary General named Mircea Joanna, a friend of mine, extraordinary person, and he's from Romania. How far things come so much. And this is what happened with all of the things that happened with the creation of NATO. The habits of mind, the practices that were created, the fact that we are all together and that we would like to recreate a NATO, even if it were very difficult to do that. My various colleagues have talked about various things. The alphabet soup we've heard about. Well, the alphabet soup is part of the great strength. The fact that we are now in a position where everybody thinks in terms of security first about NATO. They might also look to that is everybody in the North Atlantic Treaty Area. They look first to NATO before they look to anything else. In the 1990s, when we created Partnership for Peace, and we thought that was going to be sufficient for countries of Central Europe, and they said, no, we want to be members of NATO. Why? Shouldn't you rather be in the European Union? That's more important in terms of economic advance. Surely, Partnership for Peace, in which in the United States Air Force in Europe, I'm going to use a term that maybe our Air Force friends here, or even the Army friends will know, called PERS tempo. It's what do people do with their day jobs. At that time, in the United States Air Force in Europe, fully 50% of the time of people in Europe in the Air Force was spent in Partnership for Peace in the partnership countries. 50% of their time to help these countries become democratic and part of the West. But they said, no, what we really want is NATO membership. Why? If you looked at our history, you would understand why. We want, if we're going to get on with our futures, economically, politically, democracy, we want to have some kind of assurance we're not going to have the same kind of history we had for the Germans in the 30s and everybody else in the 1940s. So that was done. And if they'd had to choose, and I'm going to say this very important now, if you had to choose between NATO membership without the United States or an American commitment without NATO, in a heartbeat, they would all have said the American strategic commitment. NATO is a lot of things. And we're going to hear, I'm going to say some more before we've heard all of it now, I guess, so far. But more than anything else is the fact that the United States of America is strategically committed to the nations of Europe, that we see as indispensable the independence and the security of these countries to our own future security, prosperity, and political advance. And we are now having a particular problem with that, as you know. I am an optimist. I think that just like every other crisis that we as a country have gone through, whether, I'm not going to talk about partisan politics, we have enough crises shared by both Democrats and Republicans. It's something that two parties share in common. The United States is going to continue to be involved in Europe because it is in our fundamental strategic interest. Furthermore, as the last president once said, anything that we might want to do in the outside world anywhere, we are far better off doing that with allies, partners, and friends in the North Atlantic area than we are doing it without them. Fundamental fact. Oh, incidentally, I should have read the disclaimer. What I'm saying here is not the official position of the United States government. And by the time you finish listening to me this afternoon, you will understand exactly why. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hunter. At this time, I know we're running a little long, but I would like to open the floor up to anyone that would have a question for one of our panelists. Yes, sir.
General Wisniewski is to be commended for what Poland is doing to strengthen its armament capability in support of NATO. The same thing, unfortunately, can't be said for many of the Western European allies. Force strength has been drawn down. Expended munition stores have not been replenished. Equipment is outdated in many cases. There is a perception among the younger generation in Europe that NATO isn't all that important or pertinent, and they resent even, to some extent, our presence in theater. Given those considerations, how viable is NATO's commitment to support Article 5 in terms of its capability and its willingness? And how do you see this evolving? Is it going to get better, or will it continue down the same dangerous path as illustrated by Turkey's misbehavior?
I know you're not asking me that question, so. Fantastic. Colonel?
Sure, thanks for that question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that burden sharing concern has, come to a point several times throughout NATO history, looking back. And I would say, having been in NATO for the last few years, you could see there was I think a step change in focus since Crimea just a few years ago. And not to make a long answer, but the focus of the alliance back to the Article 5 commitment and back to the training and the equipping and the things we need. It's kind of a lag, really. It's hard to spin some of that back up, but you see even on the European side, getting to those resources and trying to work towards those high-end capabilities that you need for that Article 5 kind of warfare and commitment. And you see this weekend exercise, Trident Jupiter 19 is kicking off, this week, and you're talking major force-on-force in Northern Europe, multi-theater, multi-JOA type operations, and that's something that 5 years ago was not on the plate. That had just fallen off the plate and was not something we're exercising. So, can I speak to the resource commitments? Probably not exactly, but I'd say the intent, and especially for the militaries, is certainly to be able to do that crunchy bit of NATO that we really rely on it for. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bell.
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and my answer would be, sir, that deeds matter and words matter. You need to vote with your feet, and you need to vote with your mouth. So they're both important. In terms of deeds, my sense the last 5 years since Russia annexed Crimea and illegally and intervened militarily in eastern Ukraine has been that certainly among the European decision-making elite, politically and defense-wise, there's been tremendous reassurance and appreciation for the efforts of the United States, supported on a bipartisan basis by Congress through appropriations to do the European Reassurance Initiative with all the troops and aircraft and ships that have been surged and rotated in and out of Europe, and with the new enhanced forward presence footprint of NATO, where you have forces for the first time pushed forward to the frontier with rules of engagement that say you will engage, fight tonight. In effect, you will close on the sound of the guns if Russia comes across the border. So historically, the importance of a small number of U.S. troops in harm's way has loomed very large. We all know the history of Berlin and the brigade that was there. And it's somewhat equivalent now. The Europeans, at least at the elite governmental levels, are reassured that if Russia were to miscalculate, try to take back the Baltics, don't want to scare Lithuania and Latvia today, but if that scenario were to play out, that they would be fighting Americans. Maybe not as many Americans as the Baltics would like to have up there, but they would be fighting Americans. And to me, that's huge. And that's why I said what I said about Turkey. I can't believe that Erdogan really believed he could go in and fight and kill American men and women and just walk away from it. But words matter as well. And your question is sort of the successor generations maybe they're aware intellectually of these reinforcement and readiness efforts that have been pursued since 2014. They know something's going on, but their attention span is slight. They read headlines, they catch news blips, and when a president of the United States says, why would we want to fight for Montenegro? They're high risk. Or when you really had to work hard to get the words to be said on camera, I am committed to Article 5, it can have an effect. That's why I think the Trump administration not only has to continue its impressive work to reinforce and improve our readiness in Europe, but it's so important that the president find a way himself to say the right words at the right time.
I want to add one thing that you should watch in the future, I think. For the first time in post-war history, you're seeing a commitment inside Germany to build a military defense industry. And I have friends in Germany who've been pushing this for years and years and years. The fact that this is now happening tells us something about the future willingness of Germany to invest. What exactly it tells us isn't sure, but it's a signpost. And to me, it's a really interesting one.
Me? My judgment is anybody who underestimates the willpower of the United States, no matter who's president, is making a huge mistake. The North Koreans made that mistake in 1950. Saddam Hussein made that mistake in, 1990, big time. I wish our president would say some different things from what he's been saying. Frankly, I wish the last administration had been more robust on some things in Europe than it was. I think Mr. Putin is not a fool, and I think that he understands it. And what Bob Bell just said, I subscribe to precisely in terms of what needs to happen. In regard to Turkey, I don't think the Turks would fight us, but there is a very special problem with regard to Turkey now because it orients both towards the Middle East and towards Europe. And Mr. Erdogan, among other things he's responding to, is that the European Union played a game with Turkey year after year. They were never going to take Turkey in, but didn't say so honestly soon enough. Now, as to an opportunity for our president, whoever he happens to be the one we have, to say something definitive, unambiguous about Article 5 is December the 16th. Happens to be Beethoven's birthday, but it's going to be in London, which is a celebratory summit for the 70th anniversary of NATO. Why wasn't it held on April the 4th in Washington, in which they had a lower level ceremony in the same room where the North Atlantic Treaty was signed? Because there was a fear that the president wouldn't say the right thing. That's a terrible thing. In fact, I hoped and encouraged that he would do a drop-by. Didn't. But we're watching for December 16th. Anybody have any influence? This is a very important time for him to say the right thing. Not that it will materially change things. As Bob Bell says, the right things are being done, including by the United States, but the psychology of knowing in advance that the United States word is unimpeachable is a terribly important thing.
For the sake of time, do we have anyone with another question that they'd like to ask the panel? Yes, sir.
This is about how Dr. Hampton talked about they're not reintegrating Russia into NATO after the Cold War. Do you believe we should restructure NATO to modern times and integrate Russia?
Well, I mean, that's the question. I'm trying to struggle with it in a project I'm working on right now. So, when asked the question, what would we create today if we created something brand new? I mean, I think it's a problem. I mean, as you can tell, I'm an optimist about NATO, but I do think it's a real problem that at the end of the Cold War, we didn't really clear a straight path to how we wanted to handle Russia. And so, as I said, there have been many, sort of small steps in forging cooperation with Russia, but it's very clear that Putin had decided by 2005 that this game wasn't working. And so part of my concern here is that it reminds me too much of what the ambassador brought up, which is the European Union and Turkey. I think Russia was left sort of waiting in a waiting room where it wasn't even clear that the doctor was in. And so I don't know what the answer is. I do think there needs to be some sort of institutional mechanism in Europe. I don't know that NATO's now the institution. I think it might be a bit beyond, you know, the time when NATO could have been the institution to try and assimilate, integrate Russia. My own belief is that during the 1990s, the Russians were not as persuasive as they might have been for their own case, and that you had East European and Central European governments that were much more persuasive in negotiating their case with the West, especially the United States. And so that is what took our attention, and they won, is kind of the way I see that institutional competition. I know it's not a satisfactory answer, but it's kind of all I got right now. Thank you.
If we could show our appreciation to our panelists for today.
Thank you, Dr. Tatum, and thank you to our panelists. We've reached a point in our program today that we at Troy University would like to offer something to you, our guests. But let me preface that with a little bit. You're at the Troy University Montgomery campus. This campus is here because we serve and we partner with their university, and we have for quite a long time. Our commitment to our military and to providing higher education opportunities for them has been something that's been a part of Troy for a long time. We also have a campus down the road in Troy, Alabama. All of you are invited to visit. We'd love to have you down there and host you there on our campus as well, so we hope you will take us up on that invitation. But coming back here to Montgomery, we're in a very historical place. If you look across the street, you'll see the Rosa Parks Museum. And in our break period here, we invite you to come over. We'll go downstairs. Those of you who would like, we'd like you to tour the museum. We're going to tailor that to make it just so that you'll have plenty of time to come back, have a break, and enjoy Ambassador Hunter's keynote address. But I want you to know that this is not just a museum that happens to be here. This is the spot where Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955, got on a bus and changed this country and changed the world with an act of courage and leadership that defined something and began a movement that also played out in many ways here. So she was an incredible woman with who left an indelible legacy on this place and this country. And we try to capture a lot of that in the Rosa Parks Museum. And we at Troy University are very proud to be the stewards of that museum, and would love for you to share a few moments in there with us. Again, the logistics of this will open up, go downstairs, and we'll have people leading you across the street to the museum, and we'll take care of you in that. I would like to propose our scheduled start time for Ambassador Hunter's keynote address is 4:30, so I would like to ask that 10 minutes prior to that, 4:20, if we could all be back in place over here. If you have any needs, again, the administration desk downstairs, happy to help you with that. And at this time, we're adjourned for the tour of the Rosa Parks Museum. Thank you.